Hello and a happy new year. Today we're starting our new series, and what we're hoping is that we're going to use these first few weeks of 2021 to explore what it means to seek the most central activity we might ever consider in our lives, that of knowing God. Do you know, if 2020 taught me any lessons, it was these two. First of all, I have no idea what the future will hold. If you'd have come to me at the start of January last year and told me that we'd be having our church services totally online, we'd all be wearing face masks when we're outside, and several times a day we'd be hand sanitizing, I would have probably thought you were mad. And yet this is the reality we're now living in. But also secondly, and perhaps more importantly, I felt that I've been taught that whatever our circumstances, whatever our situation is, that God is always present. And so as we start this year, as we look ahead over the next 12 months, whilst I'm sure many of us will have particular personal hopes or dreams for the time ahead, we want to give some space to re-explore, to reconnect with what it means to know the God who is near. In a moment, I'm going to read the opening verses from Psalm 63. And as I read them, I just want to ask us to explore again what they tell us about what it means to know God himself. So Psalm 63 was a psalm written by King David when he was in the desert of Judah. And it opens like this: "You, God, are my God, and earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you. In a dry and parched land where there is no water. I've seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory. Because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands. I will be fully satisfied as with the richest of foods. With singing lips my mouth will praise you, and on my bed I will remember you. I think of you through the watches of the night, because you are my help. I will sing in the shadow of your wings, and I cling to you, for your right hand upholds me." So just for the next few minutes, I want to explore two images or two sensations that are presented in this psalm as ways we might come to know God. The first is this, that knowing God is a spiritual thirst. I don't know if you've ever experienced extreme thirst. Thankfully, living in the UK, this isn't something many of us will ever really encounter. You could almost argue we have the opposite problem sometimes. We have too much rain. And yet for David, as he wrote this, when he wrote about thirst, he wasn't just talking about an imagined sensation, but very much for him a lived experience. We don't know the exact date this psalm was written, but most likely it was when he was being persecuted by his enemies and he had had to flee to live in the wilderness. And whilst this might have brought all manner of challenges, one of the most central ones would have been a lack of water. And indeed, water is arguably our most important material. For David himself, it would have been the very source of life. Without water, our bodies can't function. Thinking more broadly, when David writes of a dry and parched land, perhaps he's pointing towards how the world itself needs water in order to be fruitful. You might think of the ways that farms and industry use water extensively to create the produce and the stuff that we need. We use water in all manner of ways. We use it for cleaning, for hygiene, for all kinds of things. And so when David says, "I thirst for you," it's worth reflecting on what he means. This image of thirst of water is one that is across the Bible. In the very opening to the Bible in Genesis chapter 1, that we see that when God created the heavens and the earth, in verse 2 we see that it's not just land that he created, but also his spirit hovered over the waters. God recognized that we need water in order to live. If we jump to the very end of the Bible, in the very final chapter of Revelation, some of the final words are almost echoing those in this psalm. When the Lord says, let everyone who is thirsty come. Let anyone who wishes to take the water of life as a gift. That sense of what it is to be Christian, what it is to know God, is to have a thirst for his water. Jesus referred to this thirst a number of times, perhaps most clearly in John 4, when he meets a woman at a local well and he asks her for some physical water from the well. And when she brings it to him, he says, everyone who drinks this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks the water I give will never thirst. In fact, this water will be like a spring of water welling within you. It's like Jesus is saying, you know that water you get from a well, the water that you might drink for yourself or use for your crops? Well, actually what you can get from me will surpass that. I can be a source of refreshment and life and growth within you. One of my favourite images in the Old Testament comes from the book of Ezekiel, where towards the end Ezekiel has this great vision of a river flowing out of the temple of God. And he describes a figure walking through this ever deepening river and seeing how this water turns even the sea water fresh. It is so powerful that it becomes populated with tons of living creatures. Fishermen, it says, line the shores of this river, waiting to catch fish that they can take home to their families to eat. The banks of this river are lined with fruit trees that produce fruit for eating and leaves for healing. And it's an amazing, extraordinary image, but it's all in this central idea that God's water brings life. Are we thirsty for God's water? David says simply that the water of God is God himself. 4 times in verse 1, you, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you. In this age where we can be increasingly self-sufficient, where we can work our whole lives to build a pension for our retirement, where we can spend decades paying off our mortgage so we've got somewhere to live, where we can get technology to fulfill almost any need, do we still thirst for God as the source of our life? This, I think, is at the root of what it means to know God. We recognize our thirst for him. So first of all, knowing God is a spiritual thirst, but secondly, it is also a spiritual hunger. You might know the song Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones, where Mick Jagger sings about a world where no matter what we hear on the radio, no matter what advertising we get from the man on the TV, satisfaction can never be found. In the words of the chorus, I can't get no satisfaction. And I wonder, perhaps for some of us, particularly as we think about the year we've just had, whether that is what we feel. Maybe we had hopes for our career, for our jobs, for our livelihoods, how it might progress over this past 12 months, and yet it hasn't panned out that way, and so we feel dissatisfied. Maybe we had hopes for people in our families, maybe for our children, maybe for our close friends and those that we hold dear, and yet they've actually had a really difficult year, and so we too feel dissatisfied. Whatever our experience has been this past 12 months, I'm sure in many ways it wasn't quite what we'd hoped. And so when David says in verse 5, I will be satisfied as with the richest of foods, we do well to wonder what he means by that. Because don't forget, this is a man who was on the run, who was likely fleeing for his life, who would have had little material provision around him. And yet he says, I have been satisfied as with the richest foods. It's interesting, the actual Hebrew of this sentence is slightly different to what we read in my version of the Bible, the NIV. In Hebrew, it says simply, my soul will be satisfied. And by soul, it means my whole life, my whole being will be satisfied. And this is where I mispronounce my terms, as with the keleb and deshen. The word keleb meaning simply fatness. Sometimes a word used to describe the marrow in a joint of meat, traditionally viewed as the richest, finest part of the meat you might give someone for a meal. And then the word deshen meaning, and you can look this up if you want, fatness. And perhaps more particularly, the fatness of blessing, of experiencing the goodness of life, being blessed by that. And so perhaps more literally we could read this as, my soul will be satisfied as with the fattest of fatness. That image of food, it's like you're saying, imagine the richest, finest, most succulent meal being presented to you. That is what my soul will be satisfied as with God. The context of this verse is praise. David says, I will praise you as long as I live. I will lift up my hands. With singing lips, my mouth will praise you. And yet at the heart, it is a praise from a place of being satisfied. The 18th century theologian Jonathan Edwards wrote about what it means to have faith. And he used a similar image, but his was to do with honey, or particularly the sweetness of it. And he says that there are two types of people who understand the sweetness of honey. The first is there are those who have a rational judgment that honey is sweet. Maybe you might think of a modern scientist being able to analyse honey at its molecular level and work out rationally that, yes, honey is sweet. But then there is the person who has tasted it. And they don't just rationally know, but perhaps experientially they know that honey is sweet. And if we were to extend Edward's metaphor further, we might say that actually as you taste the sweetness of honey, so you also gain a taste for its sweetness. Do we have a taste for the sweetness of God? Do we want to taste again the goodness of knowing the one who made us? We get glimpses across this psalm of what that might look like a bit more practically, which we'll come to over the next few weeks. We see clearly in that verse, the words surrounding that verse, there's a sense of praise as being a place of experiencing God's goodness. We see later when he speaks about remembering God and meditating on his good works, that perhaps there's a place of prayer in terms of encountering the goodness of God. When it speaks about, I have seen you in your sanctuary, beheld your power and glory, perhaps it's pointing towards worship as being a place to experience his goodness. And I don't want to get too drawn on the practicalities, but just simply to ask, are we still hungry for the goodness God offers? I'm sure for many of us, the birth of our Christian life came at a point of hunger, of hungering for something more, of desiring more from life than what we were experiencing, of hoping, if you like, that when David says, your love is better than life, that we might experience, we hungered at some point for that love of God. Is that still how it is now? I'm going to close in a moment with a prayer. But I just want to ask us, these are sometimes easy words to preach, but hard words to follow. I want to ask myself and I want to ask our community, as we look ahead over the year in front of us, do we still thirst and hunger for the things, the goodness of God? So God, you are our God. And this year, we want to seek you. We want to thirst for you. For we believe that your love is better than life. And Lord, we ask with humility, with hope, that as we come to you, you will satisfy us as with the richest of foods. Bless you all.